Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and thanks for all of you for coming today for what is a conversation. I would like to thank, first of all, Capital Law and Lowry for actually organising what is quite a challenging event. I'd like to first, before I start talking, is to thank all of the authors of this publication, which is called Metro and Me, which accompanies today's event, which is available to download, which really reflects some of the conversations we started having this morning. There's some interesting challenges in this document, and it was a real challenge actually to put it together, to get my academic colleagues to spend half an hour with a cup of coffee and a biscuit to kind of produce this. I'd also like to thank those who've already found the typos in there, and there are some of you out there, and the fact that I've actually moved the Royal Glamorgan Hospital to Newport. Again, an error, but let's not get hung up on that. The title of the talk I'm going to give is Metro more than a railway? And I think, well, it could be. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. And I think this paper and the discussions, what we're doing, we're framing some of the questions rather than the answers. And I don't think we've actually finished that process yet. So I guess in beginning to think of the questions, I think the most interesting conversation is about how people feel about this place, South East Wales, or the Cardiff Capital Region. And in fact, how many people have actually heard of the Cardiff Capital Region? I would guess not that many, and probably pretty much nobody outside of this room maybe, or certainly in the streets of Aberconboy, Tregear or Porth. And my challenge is, if we're going to use the Metro to build a connected region with lots of new infrastructure and new governance, we do need that conversation about what that means. And going back again to this morning, we've got a great history of local communities and allegiance to those communities right across the whole region, and especially in the valleys. So what does it mean to someone living in Grangetown versus Nelson versus Aberconboy versus Porth? You know, the questions they're asking about where I live, where I go, what I do, where I work are really fundamental. And it comes back to the question, is there any cultural assignment to the Cardiff Capital Region? And I think at the moment there isn't. But in contrast, and maybe a lesson for us today, I think 100 years ago, say in 1910, there was a greater sense of place in South East Wales. And we were all pretty much involved in the coal industry. We were mining, digging, shipping, washing in the supply chain. And the economic dividend of the coal industry was actually more evenly shared across the region. So everyone could share in that endeavour and feel part of a bigger place. There was even a Glamorgan authority which kind of provided a political manifestation. But following the First World War, the rise of oil, and actually the beginning of the end of coal in the 1920s, that began to fragment. I don't know if anyone in here is aware, some of you are, I know, some of that fragmentation was manifest in a book by Professor Marquand in 1936 called South Wales Needs a Plan. And he said some pretty prophetic things, and I'll read out a couple of quotes. He said, "A more rapid movement of population up and down the valleys must be encouraged so as to save the inhabitants of the northern towns from economic isolation. How that rapidity of movement can be best secured should be decided by an authority responsible for coordinated transport services." Interesting. He further said, perhaps the ministry could be asked to report whether it would be possible to electrify the railways. Interesting. And then he said, with rapid transport, it should be no more difficult for workers from Aberdare or Abervale to reach Cardiff or Newport than it is for clerks to travel to their daily work in the City of London from Wimbledon or Ealing. And finally, my favourite bit, and to all of the political representatives in the room, political and social institutions have failed to adapt themselves with sufficient rapidity to the economic changes that have taken place. One small symptom of this is the maintenance of local government boundaries which have long lost their significance and of authorities which are inadequate to the larger task which needs to be undertaken. This is 1936, right? So it's clear that good ideas and imagination are quite easy. It's actually making things happen to challenge. And a key focus for Marquand in 1936, and for me and for anybody else interested in infrastructure investments, has got to be the economy. And access to jobs and what kind of jobs is fundamental. When I was asked to undertake the 2030 Metro Impact Study, it was looking about the wider economic and regeneration benefits across the whole region, not just Cardiff, as some have unhelpfully claimed. In fact, for me, the persistent and, in my view, quite unhelpful Cardiff versus Valleys narrative is a symptom of a lack of imagination and vision for the region. And I hope today we'll begin to ask some questions which take us beyond that rather wasteful debate. And the truth is, as again mentioned this morning, the answer won't come from a civil servant's clipboard. It needs to come from communities all over the region. And the Metro could be a catalyst to frame that conversation. A conversation that says you may live in Nelson, or Pontypridd, or Porth, or Blackwood, but you can get to and from places more easily. It allows you to do different things, to work in different places, to play, to access our green infrastructure in ways you couldn't before. There's some opportunities there, perhaps we're missing. Importantly, I think that it also more immediate and pressing questions. And in the land of the pull punch, I think it's about time we actually enunciated some of those. So firstly, what houses and homes do we need and where? And I'm going to pick an example, which I might be ill-informed, but I'm going to use it anyway. So the Cardiff Capital Region and the City deal is supporting £740 million toward the Metro. At the same time, the same funding pot is being asked to fund a motorway junction along the M4 near Bridge End for a housing development that's based around cars. I wonder if that's a sensible thing to be doing with the same pot of money. There seems to be some cognitive dissonance. In contrast, the much criticised housing proposals in North West Cardiff have actually been designed around the potential of a transit corridor, but we don't have any money for that because we haven't got a plan for the future. So can we actually now in the region start to think about opportunities to develop sustainable and higher density housing around our public transport network, not just where it's easy for developers to secure planning and throw up existing housing designs that require car access? These are really fundamental long-term challenges. Why are we still building major public services and facilities in places that are not easily connected to public transport? We're still doing it, and we mentioned Llanfrecford this morning. Why are funds being considered for an airport road when there's no real transport case for that, when there are better and more sustainable public transport options? And why are some people within the city region governance debate trying to restrict growth and development in Cardiff rather than trying to support new and additional economic development across the region? Because there are opportunities. So I agree. Cardiff's not the Emerald City, and there are challenges in Mardy and Tredegar, but there are challenges in Llandudno and Ely on an equal level to those places across the region. So we must avoid the Cardiff versus Valleys narrative. It's about trying to capture the easier and obvious benefits and working hard to find new benefits. And I agree, it's hard. Lots of things haven't worked in the past. But if we can secure some of those easier benefits, then other things will be easier to do. So I'm really pleased to see the opportunities in Pontypridd, which is probably the more traditional agglomeration type of economics that some people distrust. But they do work in some places, but I agree, not for everyone and not everywhere. And in addressing these bigger questions, why can't we develop policy and source evidence to inform strategic decisions around transport and land use and economic development without being held hostage to pork barrel politics? I heard the good words this morning, and I support it, but there's still an awful lot of tension in this place, and a recognition that we haven't yet solved the problem of being honestly strategic politically across these 10 local authorities. Can local authorities involved learn how to negotiate to consider what each can give away rather than what they want? There's the challenge in the art of negotiation. Not what you want, but what you can give up to somebody else. And why are we still clinging to the old ideas of economic development? Putting up sheds everywhere is not going to work. We know that. We do need more locally focused interventions based upon people and their communities and their culture and their geography, whatever they are. And I do support the idea of the foundational economy and the need to grow circular economies. But I also think we need to be honest and challenge and test propositions and interventions that may come forward. I think there's a lack of well-rounded and well-developed propositions in this space, yet there's a need for them. Arguments are too often couched in terms of what other interventions won't do or what this place doesn't have. Actually, we should be more positive and pragmatic and come up with proposals that might work, that are different around all of South East Wales, based upon the opportunity that exists, not the need that exists. Perhaps based upon tourism, local food supply chains, our industrial and cultural heritage, which is enormous in this part of the world. And we need some honesty and maturity in developing such a plan. I don't think we're there yet. And I'd also rather avoid this polarised towns versus cities, the us and them, because it gets in the way of clear thinking. We need to look at what works in every place across South East Wales. But I do recognise these things are hard, because if they weren't, we would have solved the problems already, and we haven't. So I'd like to finish with and set up the afternoon's conversation with a story of hope. And some of you have heard this, to shine a little light of optimism across all of South East Wales. It's a story of a trip on the Valley Lines I took last year with somebody who's never been to South Wales. Never been to Cardiff, never been to the valleys, didn't know we had coal, had no idea about the geography, but was interested to find out. So I met her on a lovely sunny day at Cardiff Central, and we took the train up to Treherbert. And all the way up, she's looking out the window. We've gone from Cardiff, past the Tongwynlys Gap in Castle Corch, past the beautiful green hills that actually surround Tapswell, through Pontypridd, up the Rhondda Valley, where there were rows of fantastic cottages on the hillside, would you believe? And we got to the Treherbert station and stood on a platform, and you could see the windmill at the top of the hill against the kind of the scars of glaciation, the backdrop to that part of the world. And she thought it was beautiful. Most amazing place she'd seen. All these people living next to this fantastic green infrastructure. We then went back to Pontypridd and we got off on the platform, and she thought, what a fantastic station. Why is it so big? And I explained the fact the railways used to run everywhere and it was coal. Really? No idea. Went down to the high street, took a little trip over the river bridge. There was somebody fly fishing in the river. I said, there's the salmon are jumping this time of year in Pontypridd. They always have done. She believed that. Deadpan. But I also pointed out that the river is passing through Pontypridd and most people don't even know it's there. So how do we turn the town round to face it's probably its best asset? Went to the market and we had a cup of coffee and a Welsh cake and thought it was fantastic. And I do go up there, and enjoy soul spiced vegan curries in that place. It's fantastic. We then came back to Cardiff and went to the Coal Exchange and explained that's where the big trade deals were done in 1910. And she got a sense of a fantastic place from the top of the valley right down to Cardiff Bay with an incredible industrial, cultural, environmental and geographic legacy. And what I found is people not from this part of the world see this place in a very different way than we do. They're not constrained by a nostalgia for the industrial past that's never going to return. They see the unique urban and green environment in a very positive way. She said, there's nothing like this I've ever seen. Seriously. Someone coming here for the first time and seeing this kind of urban landscape spreading fingers from Cardiff up to the heads of all the valleys. The fantastic legacy of our industrial past, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, the fantastic hillsides, the glaciation, the potential of renewable energy. So for me, I'm optimistic because I hear that we can actually use the metro not to solve those problems, but to enable and be a catalyst for the conversations that lead to the right answers. But let's ask the right questions first. And I think actually the importance of this to local authorities, to Welsh Government, to developers and house builders is fundamental. We need to kind of embrace the opportunity and engage more widely to try and come up with the right answers. And everyone in this room, I'll ask you, take away not a preconceived view of the answer, but to recognise we need to ask more questions. Because if we're going to create a new economic future for South East Wales, it's not based upon what we do now. It's based upon the kind of place we want to create. So let's capture the easy agglomeration benefits, because they do exist, and work really hard in every place, to generate some new opportunities. Let's build a region fit for the 21st century and our future generations. I'm optimistic that we can, and in fact, we don't have a choice. We absolutely have to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think he's raised some very, very big questions about how we actually think of this place. I can recall a conference in Pontypridd a few years ago, which was arranged by the Institute of Welsh Affairs, which discussed the issue of whether South East Wales was one place or two. It didn't ask actually whether it was 10 places. And the one other thing that Mark has brought to mind, I was talking about, with a former colleague of mine who ran the BBC in Northern Ireland, and he came up with a terrific phrase where people said, look, is the problem in Northern Ireland that the people are trapped by their history? And he said, no, the problem is that their history is trapped in us. And I think it's, this session, I think, is, we're going to have two sessions this afternoon. One is about the cultural challenge of the city region, and the second session later will be about the institutional challenge, some of which we touched on in the session before lunch. To discuss this, we have on my right Yvette Vaughan-Jones, who is the Chief Executive of Visiting Arts, who spent a lifetime in the cultural sphere in Wales and in the UK and in Europe. David Llewelyn of Blaengar, who is leading on the Welsh Government's Valleys Regional Park Initiative. Emma Price from Studio Response, who's an experienced practitioner in public art with a commitment to social engagement in that process. And last but by no means least, Chris Coppock, a member of RCT's Strategic Culture and Arts Steering Group. And he's, again, been intimately involved with projects in the heads of the valleys that have tried to marry social justice objectives with cultural aims. Now, I'm going to ask each of them to make a short opening statement, really, before I open it up to the floor. So let's start with Yvette.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm aware that generally arts and creative people in conferences like this are talking to each other, and we're talking to the converted. And what's particularly good for me, I think, is to be here with so many people from different sectors, But I'm also not naive enough to think that most of the people who are not in the creative sector feel that arts and culture should be at the top of the agenda in a very complicated engineering and infrastructure project. But what I want to say is that I think good practice and learning from mistakes of other infrastructure projects should tell us that there are some very good reasons why we should involve artists and creative people in those projects right from the beginning. And we've already touched on a few of those in the last session, but I make no apologies for repeating some of that. So I think there are three key areas, in my view, for the importance of arts and culture. The first one is in the design process, in design thinking, which looks at prototyping, looks at challenging, looks at how we can think differently. And there are good examples in Los Angeles. In the report that I wrote, I mentioned that the transport department employed an artist in residence, in fact a whole series of artists in residence, not to design the transport system, but to help challenge the thinking. And if everybody looks just over here, we see an artist working here. And what she's doing, hello, you're not invisible, is externalize some of the things that are internal, some of the things that we're all hiding, and some of the things we don't want to look at, and a lot of things that we do want to look at. So she's in some ways holding up a mirror, and in other ways digging deep into a pit that we don't look at. So artists and designers are really important in that respect. Clearly we need good design and good function, and what designers will help tell us is how things work, how things flow, and that starts at governance, as Carol Ann said, and flows right through to how it looks and how it performs. So those are the whole first areas, and you asked me earlier to bring in some international comparators. Everybody talks about Bilbao. What people don't know about Bilbao very often is it was a very integrated strategy for regeneration. It wasn't about the Gulbenkian. It was about the metro that was designed by Norman Foster. It was crucially about the regeneration of the waterfront, which was a sort of drug dealers, prostitutes paradise. And they did that through creative interventions. So they had a package that worked well. But the comparator that I think is perhaps even more interesting, talking about infrastructure, is actually London 2012, the Olympics. Now, everybody knows about the Cultural Olympiad that ran alongside that, but not many people know that there was a massive arts and cultural intervention in the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Agency. Sarah Weir headed it up very brilliantly, and not only did they commission Anish Kapoor for public art within the park that still exists, but they worked with local agencies and local people on the boundary as they were creating the park, getting people to understand that this was not a boundary keeping them out, but it was a boundary that was about to be opened up for them, and how could they make that engagement. So that's the first sort of bundle of ideas about arts and culture and infrastructure projects. The second one is about making the place somewhere that you want to go to. It's been touched on before that this isn't about jobs in Cardiff only, it is about that, but it's also about people wanting to go up into the valleys. David's going to talk about the green valleys, and I think that's echoing Mark's point. We don't look up enough to see how beautiful parts of the valleys are. But it's not only about that, and it's not only about heritage. Heritage is very important, the nuanced differences between Nelson and Abertillery and wherever else you might go, and we've talked about that earlier on. But also to attract creative people there. Mid-career artists who want very big spaces to do big works of art. These people will really regenerate areas in ways that other places can't, and create that buzz. That's when the coffee shops come, the food comes, when you've got really vibrant communities of creative artists working there. And finally, and so my comparators there, particularly Berlin, I would say, but also East London. So around the Olympic Park, you also have those businesses that emerged as the biggest legacy to the Olympics, I would suggest. It's not so much the V&A going there and the creative skills being built there on the old Olympic Park, but it's all the businesses that have emerged from those particular interventions that allowed creatives to relocate there and develop their businesses. And that's where the real legacy is. So East London, I would say, is the comparator, and Berlin. And finally, engaging people. You can't just engage people. It's a very easy thing to say. A few consultations, a roadshow, a few exhibition boards is not enough. We have about 4 decades of practice of socially engaged artists working with people, helping local people in all different kinds of communities, whether it's a community of firemen or a community of hospital workers or school leavers or NEETs or whatever, helping them discover what they feel is their response to their environment, their response to the transport networks, how they want to imagine their futures. And David and I worked on a project recently in the Valleys, Stories of Change. And what we heard very, very clearly there was that people don't feel as if their voice is being heard. At least when there was coal, they were all invested and they had a ton of coal and they had some ownership of the industry. Now their energy is supplied by a foreign owned company, and the wind farms are on the hill, and there's no connection with them at all. That disconnection, that disempowerment, and what the metro could be are the power lines, following the lines of power down to the seat of power in Cardiff, and having people's voices heard in information points at every station. They could become places of exchange of ideas, and artists working in this way with local people can really help to engage in a way that other people can't. So those are my 3 ideas, I think, or areas of involvement, and the sooner we acknowledge and involve artists, the better.
Yvette, thank you very much. Let me turn to you, David. You're working hands-on in that area at the minute.
Yes. Some of you might have seen this editorial that was in the South Wales Echo by Alec Blake back in April this year, in which he says that we've been too conservative in our thinking about how we should reinvigorate the valleys. And in fact, to safeguard their future, we should turn them into a national park. And in that editorial, he says if you drive or you walk or you cycle to the Ricos or to Gelligaer Common or the Bulch, if you look from those hilltops, you'll see the magnificence of South Wales spread right before you. Now, if you haven't had the opportunity to venture north of Ton Gwynlais recently, I suggest that you do. And a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to go to the top of Mynydd y Garth in the lower Taff Valley. And the viewpoint there tells you a hell of a lot about what South Wales is and what South Wales can be, and particularly the valleys, I believe. If you look to the south, you see Cardiff, you see shimmering sort of Bristol Channel, beyond it, etc. And then if you look to the north, you see the individual valleys, the Taff, Cynon, the Rhondda, across to the Bridgend valleys, and so on. And the connectivity of the place is clear, geographically and economically. And of course, I think we often forget it was the economic wealth of the valleys that flowed down to create Cardiff, etc. So we must start to reconnect these places. The second thing that really strikes you is, the Cardiff skyline's changed dramatically since I moved to Cardiff back in 1990 now. It looks really, really different. But also then if you look north to the valleys, where I grew up, the landscapes are totally different. And the people really appreciate those landscapes. So it's about how do we make all these different connections to produce a new, vibrant future for the valleys and also for the wider region. And that's where I believe we've got to do. We've got some real opportunities in front of us to be able to do that. Now, Chris Sutton mentioned earlier on that we've got the Valleys Task Force. And out of the Valleys Task Force, maximal expectation, I think he said, a minimal delivery at the moment. We do need to deliver, and one of the things we would like to deliver on is this concept of a Valleys Regional Park. Now, not just in terms of that engagement that Chris mentioned had been done, which has been quite extensive, in which people told us in the valleys that their natural and cultural heritage assets are really much the backdrop and also the backbone for a new future for the valleys. But also on best practice elsewhere globally, Yvette mentioned, for example, things in Los Angeles and Bilbao. We've come up with a proposal for a Valleys Regional Park, which has 3 themes. And I'd like to just touch upon now, if I may, to finish off in terms of what those mean in terms of the wider city region perspective, but also in terms of what Metro can do and where these things can mesh and interconnect with each other and really make a difference. First of those themes is called landscape, culture and identity. And let's be absolutely honest, the valleys are still beset by negative connotations. There's no doubt about that. I live in Cardiff and I still hear pejorative comments made about the valleys. Unfortunately. But as I say, the people who live in the valleys really appreciate and understand their landscapes and their heritage and what it can hopefully do for them. We've got to stop looking through this distorted lens of post-industrial decay for the area and start thinking about what we can actually do with the assets that are literally on our doorsteps. And I think if we do that, we'll rebalance the city region as well. Successful cities need successful hinterlands. Look throughout the world, that's what happens. We must take advantage of that. The second theme that we're really interested in is recreation and well-being, and I'll just very quickly say about that. As Metro develops, we need to develop the opportunities for active travel, to get people out into their outdoors, walking and cycling. That will help address a lot of the issues we've got around poor health and well-being within the valleys. And then the third theme that we've selected is called communities and enterprise, and I think this is where the greatest challenges lie, but also the biggest opportunities we have, and that is the truth for both Metro and also for the Valleys Regional Park. This isn't about communities being done to now or even done with, but also done by communities, and we need to creatively and imaginatively engage with them for creative placemaking. I genuinely believe that the valleys can be one of the best places, if not the best place in the whole of Wales and the UK to live. But we must include our communities in creating that future, not tokenistic engagement. And I genuinely believe that if we do that with the Valleys Regional Park, we'll make it successful. It's not about a top-down national park that's prescriptive, but people taking ownership of it. And we'd like to work with Metro to ensure that that happens.
David, many, many thanks. Emma.
Thank you, Geraint. Passionate from both of you, actually, and whenever I hear David speak, I start to go, oh, because I'm an Aberdarian, so I do start getting very engrossed in promoting the valleys and the amazing people that are there. But I do now also live in Cardiff, yes. I spoke to Geraint briefly on the weekend, actually, and on what I could bring to the conversation today. And really, it's about being practical. So very much our role has been in Studio Response is the kind of brokers between different sectors. So the art sector, the artists we work with, and then working with developers, large project managers, not large ones, it could be small ones too, but large infrastructure and project managers working with them. We don't want to come across as utopian and going, this is wonderful, get artists on everything. We want to be pragmatic and practical. As I've written here, art, design and the engagement of creatives is often almost an accidental output, or at worst, it's at the end of a to-do list for major infrastructure projects. That means then you have limited time to really embed the creatives, be that design, architecture, art, engagement with people. It's the last thing. So I'm really heartened that Mark and his team has invited us creatives here to talk now at the beginning so that we can work with the creative sectors concurrently with the development of the Metro. There's no good, and I think Chris mentioned it earlier, but he said the pig, but there's no good putting lipstick on a gorilla. We have to start working together. Equally, for far too long, the role of transport, Metro in this case, has been seen as serving society. But I think the focus for the Metro should be on how it can shape it. So this is where we start coming into the interesting aspects of working with creative practitioners, and it's more than just aesthetics or standalone artworks and architecture. It's about effective problem solving, making infrastructure place-specific, human scale and user-friendly, enhancing the cultural offerings of people, heritage, creative industries, landscape environment, and improving quality of life not only for those who will benefit directly from the metro passengers, but for the communities that it serves. So our role is to, I feel, be pragmatic in a business sense, but also as business people that you should allow the creative sectors to also influence how you think. And that's going back to what you said, Gil. It's having confidence in yourself to have creative ideas, to listen to communities by engaging them sincerely. The other points I just briefly wanted to make is, from a practical side, we as Studio Response have received funding, not through grants, art grants and so forth, but through Section 106, the planning, supplementary planning guidance, which has been invaluable. It came from America in the 1970s, and it was called the Percent for Art policy. And effectively now, a lot of developers, sadly still only, dare I say, in Cardiff, the Vale of Glamorgan, who have SPGs. Doesn't happen so much up in the Valleys regions, but they have it in their planning policy as a condition or a Section 106. You must attribute 1% towards art. And developers are now, yeah, okay, we do it. It's formulaic for them, which is fine. We don't expect them to engage. Get the professionals to work on the artworks, but make it useful. We're now looking at more ephemeral works, engagement works. It doesn't have to be just physical works. And I think my last point is, what I would like to advocate is that the Metro and the team behind that look at creating one planning system and putting this across the region, the capital region, which would help, because you'd be able to put this percent for art, for example, within that structure, that planning structure. So we don't have to go reinventing the wheel. And also I think it might be advantageous to set up a company, perhaps a charitable company, that looks at the art, design and engagement, which, similar to that of, I don't know if some of you might know, Cardiff Bay Arts Trust, is the Arts Development Corporation. But at least it's in one place, and then we can look at match funding projects and ideas, and it will have an equal legacy. So it's not just coming in, working with communities and leaving, but there is something that happens, and it will benefit all, we feel. And it could then, after the Metro's finished, maybe 15, 20 years, the development side, it can have a legacy and carry on. And finally, social equity is very big in the Valleys and Cardiff through the people we have. You know, we probably all have sisters, daughters, brothers who work in the creative industries. They have really good ideas, but we need to start putting those on the top table, having dialogue with the engineers, the construction sectors and so forth. So my plea is, please, let's just work across and all together, not up, down. You know, we can go sideways. Thank you.
Emma, thank you very much. Chris Coppock.
Thank you, Geraint. Okay, this is actually written, so I will fly through it. So having given much thought about the Metro as a brand new and far-reaching intervention in the physical landscape between Cardiff and its region, I've come to the conclusion that at best it should be largely invisible, metaphorically at least. So an infrastructure with a lightness of touch, an infrastructure that does not create unmanageable expectations, but which provides a simple set of interlinked conduits delivering fast, light transit within and across Cardiff Capital Region. For after all, social mobility is not created by transport networks alone, however efficient. It seems to me that the real task is not about the difficulty of physical construction, which can easily be mapped against targets, delivery models and Gantt charts, and which can thus provide regeneration professionals with a neatly calibrated set of metrics in which to demonstrate their acumen and efficacy. Wouldn't it be great to see a Gantt chart that's captured social regeneration milestones and not just physical regeneration on the critical path? The real conundrum for me is addressing the elephant in the room, the cultural deficit, which we've talked about here, and acute disaffection that has existed in the region since the demise of the coal industry, and the attendant worklessness within the valleys that has led to a profound loss of work-based identity and collegiate sense of purpose. What we know is that connectivity is attitudinal as much as it is about physical infrastructure, and without an embedded people-centred engagement process with asset-based community development, i.e. where local people are recognised as fundamental strengths rather than a problem. As a driver across the Valley's communities, I have little expectation that Metro will succeed in terms of its cost-benefit analysis. I hold this view based on empiricism, not theory. I've been working as an independent advisor and contemporary art curator in both Merthyr and Blaenau Gwent for the last 6 years, and more latterly as part of Ideas, Peoples and Places, the Vanguard Arts Council of Wales initiative rolled out across Wales, premised on the idea of introducing good design into regeneration contexts in economically disadvantaged communities. The beauty of this experimental programme was that failure, and I suppose you could say mission creep as well, was seen as an acceptable means of progressing the arts, environmental and community regeneration agenda. And what was interesting was that it became clear from very early on in the process that the different organisational interests, i.e. local authorities, housing associations, arts and community groups, who became project consortia, had such fundamentally different operational cultures and expectations of outputs that the real work turned out to be about managing these different perceptions of purpose and the perceived benefits to the community rather than the production of art. Anyway, I mention this because I realise that things and the production of things are much more easy to compute in terms of outcomes and measuring productivity. But they're rarely about what is needed when we think about the years of disengagement and disaffection that the trauma of the pit closures unleashed on a once vibrant and coherent social ecology. And so when we started Arts and Minds as part of Ideas, People and Places in social housing neighbourhoods in Tredegar and Ebbw Vale, and following extensive artist-led dialogue and discussion with the residents, it became clear that the art, if it was to have any meaningful purchase, had to be directed towards addressing the fundamental issues which impact on the lives of people: poor health, antisocial behaviour, indifference from the powers that be, rather than investing time and money tarting up spaces outside their homes with site-specific sculptures, decorative flower beds and other elemental niceties. And moreover, taking the time to listen and to understand how the residents felt about their communities was utterly key. In this respect, our focus became geared towards using art as a catalyst in supporting the establishment of and creatively contributing to fora like local residents associations, where residents could use these democratic frameworks to speak directly to the authorities, whether the police, the social landlord or the local council, with a responsibility for sustainable community development. So on this account, one could reasonably ask, should art become involved in the political process in such an emphatic way? My view is that if it doesn't within the socially and economically challenged realm, it becomes largely confection in the bigger scheme of things. And so it is clear to me, anyway, that social capital and the intangibles that cannot easily be quantified are the most important things with which to measure notions of success and the efficacy of the creative process. Something that is referred to in contemporary art as relational aesthetics, where the motivation is to develop collaborative art based on or inspired by human relations in their social context. Taking on board the real politic circumstances that I experienced as a curator working within this relational framework in the valleys, I now see the folly of major physical works which are not underpinned with a fundamental commitment to facilitate and prioritise community engagement and partnership on a grand scale with accompanying levels of resource investment, and all my colleagues have kind of touched on that. And so if we want Metro to work, then I believe we needed to set in place a parallel programme of radical engagement that places local people at the centre of the decision-making and development process. And if art can be used to stimulate this bottom-up dialogue and community connectivity so that significant numbers of people whose social mobility, let's remember, social mobility, Metro has been designed to secure, feel a much greater sense of ownership, purpose and opportunity as a result, then I can see a viable future for this extraordinary high-stakes enterprise. Thank you.
Chris, many, many thanks. I mean, it strikes me there are some fairly big questions buried there. I can recall a famous Merthyr historian, Gwyn Alf Williams, the time of the miners' crisis, saying that Wales was destined to become a nation of wine waiters and museum attendants. Is this the complementary vision to what is in the south of the county, or is it actually something more solid than that?
I think it's actually far more solid than that in terms of what I talked about in terms of engaging communities, for example. There are some really good examples, and you need to get up there and find out, for example, in Treherbert. I think I mentioned it in the piece I've written, but there are a number of organisations in Treherbert now who've realised, quite rightly and understandably, that local authorities are under a lot of squeezes in terms of austerity and haven't got the capacity or capability to deliver a lot of the things they want. And these organisations have come together in Treherbert, and Yvette and I work together on the Stories of Change with them to enable the sort of things that Chris and Emma talked about, their voices to be amplified and to be heard in terms of creating a future for themselves. And we've got a great tradition of that within the Valleys. We've done things for ourselves, the Miners Institute, etc., the formation of the Tredegar Medical Aid Society and so on, forerunner of the NHS. So things are happening in the Valleys. It is not this sort of eco-museum, or for whichever it might be called. And we need to enable that. We need to empower people to be able to come together to take real ownership and stewardship of the assets that are on their doorsteps. And that, for me, includes also the metro. And I don't, for 1 minute, sort of underplay the difficulties in doing that. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of resource. But if you want these things to be successful, that's what you have to do. And
yeah, I was quite stunned by the notion of these wine waiters and museums. I thought, I don't know where that comes from, because my experience, as David says, is of small groups of young entrepreneurs doing very interesting things. The woodland people who are working up in Treherbert, really coming from their own interests, what they like doing, their own environment. And don't forget, in Pontypridd, I think there's one of the clusters, quite an important cluster on games manufacturers, aren't there, and high tech. So I don't know why, in a sense, we're making any distinction. I would also say that there's someone in the audience who I'm not going to point out, but she moved here from the northwest of England, and I remember her saying to me, I've been up to Pontypridd, the houses are really cheap there. Why don't more people live there, more sort of artists live there? And I thought, well, you're obviously from outside of Wales because there's a big stigma, or, there is that history inside, as you're talking about, that, the valleys are not the place for creative people to live. And I think fewer and fewer of us now have that feeling, and people from outside certainly don't. So, no, I think we should not make those sorts of distinctions at all. There are opportunities for creatives to work there, which I always focus on because, as you know, and you're better at the figures than me, but the creative industries contribute enormously to GDP, are increasingly a player. The UK government made it one of its 5 industry sectors for the industrial strategy, and it's clearly a very, very good sector for Wales, and we're good at it. So, and there's plenty of very good examples of creatives in the valleys, and there should be no distinction between Cardiff and the valleys in that respect.
Can I just add there on a point of information? You're talking about the creative industries and the potential there. Cardiff has been one of 9 places across the UK that's going to receive a large sum of money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Business and Enterprise Department for the development of creative clusters. What is significant about this, I think it's something like 10 million over a 4-year period. What is significant about it is one of the first times that Cardiff University, Cardiff Met, and the University of South Wales have combined in a research and development bid to the research councils. So there's a real possibility over the next years. There's a budget and a structure that can actually be used to develop those creative clusters. Sorry.
Talking about budget, I mean, one of the interesting things is that in talking about how the valleys is perceived and the infrastructure that it has, cultural institutions, they are extraordinary, but they kind of tend to be marginalised because we're still thinking about culture coming into Cardiff. And one of the things that, I've had this out with the Arts Council so many times, 50% of its funding goes into one building in Cardiff. Now, there's 10 organisations, national organisations who operate in that building, but 50% of their revenue funded their portfolio of clients, 50% of that money goes into Cardiff, into one building. Now, if you believe in decentralisation, if you believe in terms of developing places like the valleys, then ambassadors of culture like the Arts Council need to think about how they prioritise their funding, because I don't think it's sustainable to make those kind of rhetorical arguments about decentralised culture when you still put most of your money into one particular building with one very particular set of values. I think this is the issue here, that about, again, it comes down to perception, that somehow we do operate this kind of two-tier sense of culture, where there's the high art for a particular class and then there's community arts for everyone else. I think we need to look at this holistically, and if Metro's going to work, then agencies like Arts Council need to stand up and start thinking. They need to think very differently about how they use their funding capacity.
It is interesting that in 10 years, I think the number of arts organisations in Wales has declined from about 120 to 60, I think, in terms of Arts Council funding. So that's a function of austerity. But look, I do want to open this up to the floor. There's a gentleman across there on the right. And a gentleman here too. Do we have just the one mic? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Martin Rolfe. I'm a non-executive on a housing association, many of whose residents live in the valleys. And I'd like to say how pleased I am, particularly with this afternoon session, with the stress that's been put involving the people that matter in this, and not just seeing it as big capital developments for the professionals to deliver under the aegis of the professional politicians. Housing, I was delighted David mentioned housing associations. Housing associations in the valleys, amongst as much more than anywhere else, if anything, are a great resource for being involved as partners in engaging their residents, because they strive to do it themselves and have had successes and failures in doing that. So I do, and all sorts of other organisations do as well. You're talking about younger people. What about primary schools and getting them involved as the thing develops? Because that way you reach quite a lot of young adults as well. So I think there's got to be a stress on more on engagement. I was disappointed with a recent Institute of Wales Affairs report, a launch event in the University of South Wales last week, where the audience, very, very knowledgeable audience, kept raising, in response to what was said from the stage, the importance of engagement. It's not just about what the highly trained and highly skilled are doing. And I think you were referring that to yourself, even in the business of arts creatives. It's not even just about the professional arts creatives. It's about the population at large. Okay. So, yeah, please carry on that route.
Gentleman here in the front row.
I'm Ken Barker from Cardiff Cycling Campaign. My question really is to those who are delivering the Metro plans, and of course they're concentrating as much on the infrastructure, the railways, the tracks, the stations, but what commitment have they made to engagement at all levels with all communities and stakeholders? Thank you. And secondly, in specific terms, what commitment have they made to the status of the Welsh language, both in service obligation and in engagement and in governance?
I'm not sure. Well, if you're asking, I'm not sure that we know precisely what the. Emma.
Only from my knowledge of kind of the engagement to date of what the Metro's done. I know it's been really interesting that they've engaged a local company who has done some fantastic marketing and branding to get this going. So yes, to get it started, which has been really interesting. And again, you know, it's about that. We have to start somewhere. I'm saying we. I'm not the Metro. The Metro has to start somewhere, and I think. To engage people, there has to be something that they can visually lock onto in the first instance, But you're absolutely right. There now needs to have those conversations pan-communities and as well as larger organisations. They're also, and this was mooted in the previous discussion, SMEs and young. Well, I know people say about young people, but there's also us kind of middle-aged people who also want to be engaged too. Sorry, I was 42 is the meaning of life, but am I still young or am I old? I don't know. But it's engagement with those organisations that are outside the usual suspects or, that we tend to engage with in Wales. And we are a little bit naughty, I think, sometimes for just going back to our default position, whereas really, this metro has the opportunity to create new rules where people from outside, nationally, internationally, will look to us and go, oh, that's an interesting way of doing things, that's an interesting way, and why not use the engagement, the societal, the cultural, the arts as that hook?
Gentleman right at the back. There we are.
I was going to say I'm Irish, I probably don't need this, but my name's Kieran, I work with Christina Rees, the MP for Neath. I just want to say, as still a tourist really, I've only been living here about 5 years, and I think this is a great project for promoting tourism, in particular in the valleys, and David nodding there, you've obviously mentioned it and stuff, and Mark mentioned it, but I was just wondering, has there been any engagement with like Visit Wales and stuff like that for like advertising the valleys outside of Wales or anywhere really?
David.
Well, in terms of the Valleys Regional Park, if we hopefully take it forward, which I hopefully we will do, Visit Wales are very much a partner in that, and we need to work collaboratively with them, and we are doing so. So hopefully that answers your question in that respect. Can I just make one point though? Tourism, obviously, a lot of people still think it's going to be measured in terms of what it means in terms of GDP, GVA, etc. Right? But I think more fundamentally, this comes back to what other metrics, sort of Chris mentioned. What is Metro going to do? What will the Valleys Regional Park do for places in the valleys? Right? And it's not all about creating wealth through GDP measurements or GVA measurements. It's about how well people think about their place, how they feel that they fit there, and that's what this project needs to do, and that's what the Valleys Regional Park needs to do as well.
I think that's a very powerful point. I did see another hand here. Elaine Davey.
I was going to make the same points actually. I'm Elaine Davey, Wales Heritage Group. Shout out for heritage. It's not just about bars and things, but I think it's changing perceptions of Wales. We do have that burden of perhaps not celebrating, this wonderful initiative, Valleys That Change the World. And on the European route of industrial heritage, lots of the world's industrial firsts were here. We're not celebrating that. We're not drawing people in. And the tourists will be travelling. People will be coming into Cardiff to work, but they'll be travelling up on those lines that brought the coal down here and made the wealth of Cardiff. And they should know about it. I mean, simple things like it drives me mad every time I go past Sainsbury's in Pontypridd, that they don't have a poster, that very famous image of Brunel before the Brown Lennox chains. And Sainsbury's is on that site of the Brown Lennox works. Simple stuff like that could be happening all over South Wales to make people feel, wow, that was us. We roofed the world, we fueled the world, we did all those things, starting here with the Penydarren locomotive. We don't do enough for that. So can that be part of Metro, please?
Robert Chapman.
Okay. Do you want me to shout?
No, there's a mic.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. It's a bit of an observation, really. I'm not a voice box here for One Voice Wales, but One Voice Wales, just as an observation, is the umbrella body for community councils pan-Wales. And actually, there are 730 community councils pan-Wales. So I'm kind of wondering, okay, what about for the 10 local authority areas in the metro area, and how are they being engaged to represent the people in those areas vis-a-vis the metro? And maybe there's a role for creatives and artists to facilitate that engagement.
I think it's a fair point. In terms of expertise on public engagement, there's an awful lot in the arts sector itself. So do you want to respond?
Well, I think what's emerging is really the how. We're all saying the right things in the previous section in this session too. And I know in the previous session there was a sort of call for a development agency, whatever else, and partnerships. And I think that if there's one thing that comes out of this day, it should be that there are a lot of people who would like to be part of creating that overall integrated strategy, that there are very good examples of practice already, and particularly in the valleys, and there's been decades of very good engagement, but not joined up and not well enough celebrated and so on. So I think there's a lot of expertise, a lot of very interesting ideas, but that there is a real need for us to have a voice within that strategy for the Metro, and I'm looking at Mark, and it's not his problem, but I don't know who else to look at. It seems to me that that's what we're saying. Can we look at the governance? Can we look at the engagement? Can we look at how these things get into the thinking of the infrastructure builders? And we know that they've got a lot on their plate anyway.
Sorry, Mark?
Can I just make a quick point?
Yep.
One of the challenges is not to wait for the tablet of stone to come down to you and say this is what you
to do it.
Yeah.
Part of it is about just doing it.
Saying it. Yeah.
And actually, some of them won't work. Some of them will be wrong. But, sorry. Yeah, so just grab hold of the initiative, whoever you are, wherever you are. Don't wait for the tablet of stone, because it may not come.
But I presume there'll be something coming out of this day, and that would be the message, wouldn't it?
The message of this day is go off and have the same conversation with someone who wasn't here and say, what are we going to do? What are we going to do different? Who else can we get involved in this conversation? And let's get a whole bunch of stuff happening. And I don't know what the answer is.
I should say, Mark, that one of the things that has happened, there is an arts network called What Next, which has sort of branches. One branch in Cardiff, and the other based around Pontypridd and across the valleys. And those two have actually put in a strategy paper to the Capital City Region Cabinet on the role of culture within the development of the city region. And I think we're awaiting a sort of a response on that at the minute. Yeah.
This is just really, Gary Thompson. This is just as much as anything an observation. I mean, I think a lot of people in the room know where I'm from, which is Liverpool. And I look back at, a big, shall we say, change which happened with capital culture. I remember being down in the docks as a child, where there was, shall we say, pigeon muck everywhere. And, the Albert Dock nearly got knocked down and so on and so forth. The city was in a position where it was low on confidence, didn't think it was going to win capital culture, actually won it. I mean, I've been there with Mark, I think Simon behind me somewhere, Jones has been there recently in regard to Transport for Wales and other things. Now, I look at this in terms of this is a catalyst. I mean, I've got a couple of artists myself in the family. If you look at, I'm just thinking of the umbrella body. The umbrella body is the Arts Council. If it got a bunch of you guys in the room and effectively said, that's what that route map looks like. We've got a network there. How can we map our cultural assets on top of that? And how can we make the relevant different art interventions and then join it together? So that does, I'll give you an example. In Liverpool, Crosby Beach. Well, nobody went to Crosby Beach, but now you've got the Iron Men there in terms of. So for me, really, there's a catalyst of an opportunity, and it's effectively, there may not be. Let's go and ask the city region or the what's the name for money. It could actually just be there's an opportunity there for a joined upness which sits alongside it. That's just an observation from somebody who's seen things like this happen up north.
I'm afraid our time is up, but I am going to ask the panel. I mean, do you think that the cultural development of the city region, if you like, the formation of a regional identity, can happen any faster than the building out of the metro itself?
Yes, I do. I think it needs to. I think it needs to work in parallel, but I think there is a momentum now that the cultural sector, as you said, the What Next networks and so on, need to get together and talk about. I mean, gentlemen talked about capital of culture. I think we have to create our own milestones and our own major events that will form that catalyst. But I do think that the Metro is the catalyst, and many people know I've written about this, that this is something that can be the change maker, and we should be really backing it in that respect.
Yeah, I was just reading something in terms of what Mark said and what's been said here. Carol Ann, in her piece in the publication, said key appointments have been made that crank up the momentum towards delivery. And that to me is really significant, because I think what we know we need, which is this social investment, has to compete with the cranked up delivery. And I think it's that relationship between cranking up delivery and delivering on social inclusion that is our key problem. And I wait to see if that opportunity to have this kind of level of dialogue and involve those kind of community council bodies in the way that we would like to embrace all the kind of stuff we're talking about. If that can happen, I think this is going to be extraordinary, and I think it will be about setting a new paradigm for the development of a regional culture. But I have to say, I'd say the judgment's out on that, because I think as soon as a massive infrastructure project becomes activated, then decisions have to be made very quickly. And what we need now, I think, is a lot of time for contemplation about what our culture is and what it means. And I'm not sure that that delivery process can provide that, but I hold my fingers crossed.
Go on.
Well, just to say, yes, I agree with you, Chris. You know, we've been debating what our cultural identity can be, is, should be for many, many years. But in terms of a practical application of working with the creative industries and art design, architecture, I get nervous and I want to jump on board with these guys and say, don't leave us behind. So let's start looking at kind of pragmatic ways and best value. And I hate using that word with art, but it is, you know, we have to look at the best value of working with the creative industries. It'll come back to the organiser, it'll come back to the Metro. The money, you know, your return on your investment of working with people in the creative industries will yield good results. And particularly in the valleys, just very quickly, the creative output now, the cultural and creative output of the valleys is immense. We all know the bands and the artists and the fashion designers and so forth. But as Yvette said, and I agree with you, it's having a cohesive approach and how we promote it cohesively. You know, us from the valleys like to go to Cardiff. People from Cardiff like to come up to the valleys. What for, why, how? We still have to work that in, as well as the kind of physical transport. Oh, sorry.
Great. I think if there's one final message, there is a cultural agenda. It is one where the sector would be very happy to see Transport for Wales, the City Region Cabinet, 10 local authorities, you know, all taking that up. Again, as was said early this morning, in a cohesive way. But let me thank all four members of the panel. Thank you very much.